The wind howled like a starving wolf across Truckee, California, as Margaret Sinclair hurried down the dusty Main Street, her reputation trailing behind her like a tattered shawl. It was 1876, and in this mining town nestled in the Sierra Nevada mountains, a woman alone might as well wear a scarlet letter. Today, that would change for better or worse. Margaret clutched her worn leather-bound journal to her chest, her steps quickening as she approached the small, whitewashed church at the edge of town. Inside waited Franklin Dobbs, a man 30 years her senior with yellowing teeth and breath that reeked of tobacco, but also the owner of the largest general store in Truckee, and her last hope for salvaging what remained of her good name. 3 weeks ago, she'd been found alone with Christopher Finley in his cabin after nightfall when his horse had gone lame during their return from delivering medicines to outlying homesteads. Nothing improper had occurred. She had merely been assisting the town's new doctor with his rounds, but in Truckee, perception trumped truth. The whispers started immediately, and within days, her position as the schoolteacher hung by a thread. "Miss Sinclair," Franklin nodded as she entered, his eyes roving over her figure with undisguised appreciation. "Beautiful as ever on your wedding day." Margaret forced a smile, though her stomach churned. At 22, she was trading her future for security and respectability. "Mr. Dobbs, thank you for your punctuality." The ceremony was brief. Just the minister, Franklin, Margaret, and 2 witnesses pulled from the street. When it concluded, Franklin leaned in for a kiss, his hand already possessively at her waist. "Mrs. Dobbs now," he whispered against her ear. "I expect you in my bed tonight." Margaret nodded stiffly, her eyes fixed on the cross hanging above the altar. She had made her choice. 2 months into her marriage, Margaret stood behind the counter of Dobbs' general store, tallying the day's receipts. Franklin had at least kept his promise to maintain her respectability. No one dared whisper about her now. She was Mrs. Franklin Dobbs, and her husband's influence in town ensured her position at the school remained secure. The bell above the door jingled, and Margaret looked up to see Dr. Christopher Finley enter, removing his hat as he stepped inside. Her heart stuttered. She had avoided him since the wedding. "Mrs. Dobbs," he greeted formally, his blue eyes betraying nothing of their shared past. At 30, Christopher Finley cut an impressive figure with his broad shoulders and strong jawline, softened only by the kindness in his gaze. "Dr. Finley, what can I help you with today?" Her voice remained steady despite the fluttering in her chest. "I'm in need of some supplies for my practice. Bandages, alcohol, and some laudanum if you have it." Margaret nodded and moved around the counter, grateful for the familiar routine of gathering items. "How is Mrs. Peterson faring after the birth of her twins?" "Well enough. She's strong." He paused. "And you, Margaret, how are you faring?" The use of her given name, spoken softly so only she could hear, made her freeze. She glanced toward the back room where Franklin was taking inventory. "I am as well as can be expected, Dr. Finley," she replied formally. "That will be $3.45. Christopher placed the money on the counter but didn't immediately take his purchases. "I'm heading out to the Turner Ranch tomorrow. There's sickness there. I could use an assistant." "I'm afraid that's impossible," she answered, her voice tight. "I have responsibilities here." "Of course." He nodded, his expression unreadable as he gathered his supplies. At the door, he turned back. "If you ever need anything, Margaret, anything at all." The door closed behind him before she could respond, leaving her with an ache in her chest and the lingering scent of his bay rum aftershave. That evening, Margaret prepared Franklin's dinner, moving mechanically through the kitchen of the small apartment above the store. She had learned early in their marriage that Franklin expected punctuality, cleanliness, and obedience. Anything less resulted in a demonstration of his displeasure, sometimes verbal, sometimes physical. "Smells good," Franklin commented as he settled at the table, immediately reaching for the whiskey bottle. "How were sales today?" "Good. We sold 3 of the new plows that came in last week," Margaret answered, setting a plate of beef stew before him. "And Mrs. Henderson finally paid her account in full." Franklin grunted in approval, already shoveling food into his mouth. "That doctor came by today, didn't he?" Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she served herself. "Yes, he needed medical supplies." "I don't like the way he looks at you," Franklin said, his eyes narrowing. "Remember who you belong to now." "I'm well aware of my position, Mr. Dobbs," Margaret replied carefully. Franklin seemed satisfied with her answer and returned to his meal. Later, when he called her to their bedroom, Margaret closed her eyes and endured his attentions as she always did, retreating to a place in her mind where she was free, riding across open plains with the wind in her hair, answerable to no one. Spring turned to summer, and summer to autumn. Margaret's life fell into a predictable pattern, teaching during the day, working in the store in the afternoons, and attending to Franklin's needs in the evening. If she sometimes caught herself watching the road out of town with longing, no one seemed to notice. Dr. Finley became a regular customer at the store, always polite, always formal. If his eyes lingered on the fading bruise at her wrist or the shadows beneath her eyes, he never commented. Margaret told herself it was better this way. Her reputation was intact, her position secure. This was the life she had chosen, until the November night when everything changed. The pounding at the store's front door startled Margaret from sleep. Franklin grunted and rolled over, the whiskey he'd consumed ensuring he wouldn't wake easily. The pounding continued, more urgent. Throwing on a robe, Margaret hurried downstairs, lamp in hand. Through the window she could see Christopher, his face drawn with urgency. "What is it?" she asked, opening the door just enough to speak through. "Diphtheria at the Murphy homestead," he explained quickly. "All 3 children. I need supplies and I need help. I can't manage alone." Margaret hesitated, glancing up the stairs. "I can get you supplies, but Margaret," Christopher said, his voice low and intense. "Those children could die without proper care. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't dire." She thought of the Murphy children, Emma, just 6, with her gap-toothed smile, William, 8, always bringing her wildflowers, and baby James, barely 2. Franklin would be furious, but how could she refuse? "Give me 5 minutes," she whispered, already turning to gather what they would need. The ride to the Murphy homestead took nearly an hour in the darkness, their way lit only by Christopher's lantern. They spoke little, focused on the urgency of their mission, but Margaret couldn't help feeling a sense of liberation as they rode through the night, her hair coming loose from its pins in the wind. The scene at the homestead was grim. Sarah Murphy, exhausted and frantic, had been trying to care for all 3 children alone while her husband was away on a cattle drive. The children lay listless in their beds, their breathing labored, faces flushed with fever. "Thank God you've come," Sarah sobbed as they entered. "I didn't know what else to do." "You did right to send for me," Christopher assured her, immediately moving to examine the children. "Mrs. Dobbs will help us prepare the treatments." For the next several hours, Margaret worked alongside Christopher, preparing solutions of carbolic acid for throat swabbing, administering ipecac to induce vomiting, and applying cool compresses to lower fevers. They worked in tandem, anticipating each other's needs without words, focused entirely on saving the children's lives. Dawn was breaking when the worst seemed to pass. Little Emma's fever broke first, followed by William's. Baby James still struggled, but his breathing had improved. "You should rest," Christopher told Margaret as Sarah finally succumbed to exhaustion on a chair beside the children's beds. "You've been magnificent." "I can't go back yet," Margaret admitted, her voice barely audible. "Franklin will be awake by now. He'll know I left." Christopher's expression darkened. "What will he do?" Margaret couldn't meet his eyes. "What he always does when I displease him." A muscle twitched in Christopher's jaw, but his voice remained gentle. "You don't deserve that, Margaret. You never have. It doesn't matter what I deserve. I made a choice, under duress, to save your reputation after I failed to protect you from gossip." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. "I've regretted that night ever since, not because anything improper happened, but because I didn't stand up for you afterward." Margaret looked up, surprised. "There was nothing you could have done. I could have made it clear to everyone that you were helping me on a medical emergency. I could have confronted the rumors directly instead of hoping they would fade." He took a step closer. "I could have asked you to marry me before Dobbs did." The confession hung between them like a tangible thing. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. "It's too late for that now," she whispered. "Is it?" Christopher's blue eyes searched hers. "You're not safe with him, Margaret. Everyone in town knows it, even if they don't speak of it." Before she could respond, baby James began coughing again, drawing them back to their patients. The moment passed, but something had shifted between them, a truth acknowledged that could not be unsaid. Margaret stayed at the Murphy homestead for 3 days, caring for the children alongside Christopher. They fell into an easy rhythm, working together during the day and talking long into the night after Sarah and the children slept. Christopher told her of his training back east, his dreams of establishing a proper hospital in Truckee. Margaret shared stories from her childhood in Boston, her love of literature, and her hopes of someday writing stories of her own. On the third evening, as they sat beside the fireplace drinking coffee, Christopher asked the question that had been hovering between them. "What will you do when we return to town?" Margaret stared into her cup, watching the firelight reflect off the dark liquid. "What can I do? I made vows." "Vows made under coercion to a man who hurts you," Christopher countered gently. "There are other options." "Are there?" She looked up at him, her expression bleak. "Divorce would ruin me completely. I would lose my teaching position. I have no family to return to. Where would I go? What would I do?" Christopher leaned forward, his eyes intent on hers. "Come with me." "What?" Margaret's heart seemed to stop. "I've been offered a position at a new hospital in Sacramento. It's why I came to Truckee in the first place, to gain experience before taking the post." He reached for her hand. "Come with me, Margaret. We can start fresh where no one knows us." "As what?" "Your mistress." The word tasted bitter on her tongue. "As my wife, eventually, when you're free." His thumb traced circles on her palm. "Until then, as my medical assistant with your own rooms, your own life. You don't have to hide anymore, Margaret. Not who you are, not what you want, not the bruises he leaves on you." Hope flared briefly in her chest before reality doused it. "Franklin would never let me go. He sees me as his property." "Then we don't ask his permission." Christopher's voice was firm. "We leave while we can." Margaret pulled her hand away, fear replacing hope. "You don't understand. He would find me. He has friends everywhere, merchants, lawmen. There's nowhere in California I could hide from him. Then we go farther, Oregon, Washington Territory, wherever you want to go." He caught her gaze and held it. "I won't let him hurt you again." The promise hung between them, tempting and terrifying. Margaret stood abruptly, moving to the window where she could see the snow beginning to fall. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This isn't a decision I can make lightly." Christopher nodded, respecting her space. "Of course. But Margaret," he waited until she turned to look at him. "You deserve happiness. Remember that." On the fourth morning, with all three Murphy children on the mend, it was time to return to Truckee. Margaret's stomach knotted with dread as they rode, the town coming into view as they crested the final hill. "I could take you somewhere else," Christopher offered quietly as they paused, looking down at the settlement. "Right now, we could just keep riding." For one wild moment, Margaret imagined it the freedom, the possibility of a life without fear. Then reality asserted itself again. "I need to face him," she said firmly. "I won't live as a fugitive, always looking over my shoulder." Christopher nodded, though his expression was troubled. "I'll be at my office if you need me, day or night." They parted at the edge of town, Christopher heading toward his small clinic while Margaret steeled herself to return to the store. The streets were busy with midday traffic, and several people stopped to stare as she passed. News traveled fast in Truckee. Everyone would know she had been gone for days with the doctor. Franklin was waiting behind the counter when she entered, his expression deceptively calm. The store was empty of customers. "Welcome home, wife," he said, his voice eerily pleasant. "Enjoy your little adventure." Margaret straightened her shoulders. "The Murphy children were dying. They needed help. And naturally, you were the only one who could provide it." Franklin came around the counter slowly. "Not Mrs. Peterson, not Widow Jenkins, both experienced with sickness." "No, it had to be my wife, who spent 3 nights alone with the doctor. Sarah Murphy needed help with her children. That's all it was," Margaret insisted, fighting the urge to back away as he approached. Franklin's pleasant facade cracked. "Do you think I'm a fool? The whole town is talking about how you ran off with him. My own wife making me a laughingstock." His hand shot out, gripping her arm painfully. Margaret winced but didn't cry out. "Those children would have died without help," she said, meeting his gaze steadily. "I did what was right." The slap came without warning, the force of it sending her staggering back against a shelf of canned goods. Pain bloomed across her cheek, and she tasted blood where her teeth had cut into her lip. "You did what was right," Franklin sneered, advancing on her again. "Your place is here with your husband. Your duty is to me." He grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her violently. Margaret's head snapped back, striking the shelf behind her. Stars exploded behind her eyes as his hands moved to her throat. "No one will ever respect me if I can't control my own wife," he growled, his fingers tightening. "Maybe it's time I taught you your place once and for all." Margaret clawed at his hands, panic rising as her breath came in gasping wheezes. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. This was it. He would kill her here in his own store in broad daylight. The bell above the door jingled, and Franklin immediately released her, stepping back with a practiced smile already forming. Margaret slumped against the shelf, gulping air. "Ah, Sheriff Miller, what can I do for you today?" Franklin's voice betrayed nothing of what had just transpired. Sheriff Miller paused just inside the doorway, his eyes moving from Franklin's flushed face to Margaret's clearly developing bruises. His expression hardened. "Franklin, I think you'd better come with me," he said evenly. "Got some questions about that shipment that came in yesterday." Franklin hesitated, glancing back at Margaret with a warning in his eyes. "Can it wait? I was just discussing something important with my wife." "No, it can't wait," the sheriff replied firmly. "Mrs. Dobbs looks like she could use some time to catch her breath anyway." Something in the sheriff's tone made it clear this wasn't a request. Franklin's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly, grabbing his coat from behind the counter. "This isn't finished," he muttered to Margaret as he passed. Then louder, "Mind the store, wife. I'll be back soon." The moment the door closed behind them, Margaret's legs gave way and she slid to the floor. Her throat burned and she could feel the pulse of rising bruises on her neck and face. She needed to think quickly. Franklin wouldn't be gone long, and when he returned, She forced herself to stand, moving behind the counter where they kept the day's earnings. There wasn't much, $67 and some change. Not enough to get far, but it would have to do. Upstairs, she hastily packed a small bag with essentials, a change of clothes, her journal, the locket that had belonged to her mother, and the small Derringer pistol Franklin kept in his bedside drawer. She was halfway down the stairs when the store door opened again. Freezing in place, Margaret clutched the banister, certain Franklin had returned. Instead, Christopher stood in the entrance, his expression changing from determination to shock as he took in her appearance. "My God, Margaret," he breathed, crossing the store in long strides. His fingers gently tilted her chin up to examine the bruising on her face and neck. "Did he do this to you?" "The sheriff took him away," she managed, her voice raspy. "I don't know for how long." Christopher's eyes darkened with fury. "I'm getting you out of here. Now." This time Margaret didn't argue. "I have a bag packed and some money." "Good. We'll take my wagon. It's faster than riding with your injuries." He took her bag, then wrapped his coat around her shoulders. "Is there anything else you need?" Margaret glanced around the store that had been her prison for months. "No, nothing here matters." Outside, Christopher helped her into his wagon, tucking blankets around her before climbing up beside her. The town seemed unnaturally quiet as they pulled away from the store, though Margaret could feel eyes watching from behind curtains and through shop windows. "Where are we going?" she asked as Truckee began to recede behind them. "To the station first," Christopher replied, his expression grim. "There's a train leaving for Sacramento in 30 minutes. We need to be on it. The Murphy children are recovering well. Sarah's sister arrived yesterday to help." He glanced at her. "There's nothing keeping us here now." Margaret nodded, trying to ignore the throbbing pain in her head and throat. "What about your things? Your clinic?" "None of it matters more than getting you to safety." His hands tightened on the reins. "I should have taken you away the first time I saw bruises on your wrists." "I'll never forgive myself for waiting." "This isn't your fault," Margaret insisted. "I made my choice when I married him, under duress, to save your reputation after I failed to protect you." Christopher's voice was tight with self-recrimination. "A reputation that wasn't even tarnished until people made assumptions about that night." Margaret reached over and placed her hand on his arm. "We can't change the past, only what we do next." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, a promise. Then Christopher flicked the reins, urging the horses faster toward the train station and whatever future awaited them. The train station was bustling with activity when they arrived, travelers coming and going, porters loading baggage, and the massive iron locomotive huffing clouds of steam as it prepared for departure. Christopher helped Margaret down from the wagon, keeping his arm around her waist to support her still wobbly legs. "Wait here," he instructed, settling her on a bench away from the main crowd. "I'll purchase our tickets and see about the wagon and horses." Margaret nodded, pulling his coat more tightly around her to hide the bruises on her neck. Every few seconds, she glanced nervously toward the road from town, half expecting to see Franklin charging toward them with the sheriff in tow. Christopher returned quickly, 2 tickets in hand. "All set. The station master will see to my wagon being returned to town and our luggage is being loaded." He studied her face with concern. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," she assured him, though the throbbing in her head suggested otherwise. "Just anxious to leave." 5 more minutes, he promised, sitting beside her and taking her hand in his. "Then we'll be on our way to a new life. A life where she wasn't Mrs. Franklin Dobbs, where she could perhaps teach again, or write, or simply exist without fear." It seemed too good to be true, and Margaret found herself holding her breath, waiting for something to go wrong. She didn't have to wait long. Margaret. Franklin's voice cut through the station noise like a whip crack. Margaret froze, her fingers tightening convulsively around Christopher's. Her husband stood at the entrance to the platform, his face purple with rage, Sheriff Miller a few steps behind him looking deeply uncomfortable. "Don't let him take me back," she whispered, real fear making her voice tremble. Christopher stood, positioning himself between her and Franklin. "Stay here, I'll handle this." Franklin stormed toward them, people scrambling out of his path. "Get away from my wife, Finley," he bellowed. "Margaret, get over here now." Christopher didn't budge. "Mrs. Dobbs isn't going anywhere with you. That's my wife, and I'm taking her home." Franklin turned to the sheriff. "Miller, arrest this man for trying to steal my wife." Sheriff Miller sighed, looking profoundly unhappy with the situation. "Doc, maybe it's best if you step aside. This is a domestic matter." "Is it domestic to nearly strangle your wife?" Christopher demanded, his voice carrying across the platform. Several passengers turned to stare. "To beat her regularly, to terrorize her. That's slander," Franklin spat. "My wife is prone to hysterics and lies. She needs a firm hand." Margaret stood shakily, unwrapping the coat from around her shoulders to reveal the vivid purple bruises forming on her neck in the unmistakable pattern of fingerprints. A gasp went up from the onlookers. "Are these lies, Mr. Dobbs?" she asked, her raspy voice somehow carrying in the sudden hush. "Is this your firm hand?" Franklin's expression flickered between rage and calculation. "You fell," he said flatly. "Clumsy woman fell against the counter. Tell them, Margaret." The train whistle blew, signaling the 5-minute warning before departure. It was now or never. "Sheriff Miller," Margaret said, turning to address the lawman directly. "My husband tried to kill me today. These are not the marks of a fall. They are the marks of his hands around my throat." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving to rest on his holstered gun as he assessed the situation. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Dobbs." "It's the truth," she insisted. "And it wasn't the first time. She's leaving town with another man." Franklin shouted, gesturing wildly at Christopher. "She's trying to escape the consequences of her adultery." "There was no adultery," Christopher stated firmly. "Mrs. Dobbs assisted me with the Murphy children who were critically ill, that's all." "A likely story," Franklin sneered. "The whole town knows you've been pining after her since you arrived." The train whistle blew again, 3 minutes to departure. Sheriff Miller finally stepped forward, his decision apparently made. "Mr. Dobbs, I think it's best if you come back to town with me. These accusations need to be sorted out properly." "You're taking their side." Franklin looked incredulous. "After all I've done for this town, after the donations to your re-election campaign," the sheriff's expression hardened. "That's enough, Franklin. You're making this worse for yourself." Franklin's face contorted with rage as he realized he was losing control of the situation. With surprising speed for a man his size, he lunged forward, shoving Christopher aside to grab Margaret's arm. "You're my wife," he hissed, yanking her toward him. "You belong to me." Christopher recovered quickly, grasping Franklin's wrist. "Let her go." The two men struggled, Margaret caught between them as the gathering crowd backed away. Franklin's free hand formed a fist, landing a solid blow to Christopher's jaw that sent him staggering back. With a cry of triumph, Franklin began dragging Margaret toward the station exit. "Stop right there, Dobbs." Sheriff Miller drew his weapon. "Release her now." Franklin froze, then slowly turned, still gripping Margaret's arm painfully. "You won't shoot me, Miller. You don't have the spine for it." "Maybe not," the sheriff conceded. "But I will arrest you for assault, right here in front of half the town." For a moment it seemed Franklin might comply. Then his grip on Margaret tightened and he yanked her in front of him like a shield. "You're coming with me," he growled in her ear. "And when we get home, You'll learn what happens to wives who try to leave their husbands." In that moment, something broke inside Margaret, the last remnant of the frightened, compliant woman she had forced herself to become. Her free hand slipped into the pocket of her dress, finding the cold metal of Franklin's own derringer. "No," she said simply, and pressed the barrel against his side. "I won't." Franklin froze, his breath hot against her neck. "You wouldn't dare." "I would rather die than go back with you," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "Let me go, Franklin. Let me go, and I won't shoot." The final train whistle blew 1 minute to departure. Franklin's grip loosened slightly. "This isn't over," he warned. "You'll never be free of me." "Yes, she will," Christopher said, stepping forward again, his jaw already bruising from Franklin's punch. "Because if you ever come near her again, I'll kill you myself." Franklin's eyes darted between them, calculating his odds. Then, with a snarl of frustration, he shoved Margaret away from him. She stumbled but managed to keep her footing and her hold on the derringer. "Sheriff, arrest them both," Franklin demanded. "She threatened me with a gun. He's abducting my wife." Sheriff Miller holstered his weapon with a weary sigh. "What I saw was a woman defending herself after you assaulted the doctor and used her as a shield." He glanced at the gathered crowd. "I reckon there are plenty of witnesses who would agree with my version of events." A murmur of assent went through the onlookers. Franklin's face darkened as he realized he had lost not only his wife but also the respect of the town. "All aboard," the conductor called from the train. Christopher gently took Margaret's arm. "We need to go." She nodded, tucking the derringer back into her pocket before allowing him to guide her toward the train. At the steps, she paused, looking back at Franklin one last time. "Goodbye, Mr. Dobbs," she said clearly. "I release myself from our marriage." With that, she climbed aboard, Christopher following close behind. As the train pulled away from the station, Margaret watched the town of Truckee grow smaller through the window, Franklin's diminishing figure standing rigid on the platform until he disappeared from view entirely. Only then did she allow the tears to come. The train compartment was modest but private, with 2 bench seats facing each other and a small window through which the Sierra Nevada landscape rolled past in a blur of green and gold. Margaret sat with her forehead pressed against the cool glass, tears sliding silently down her cheeks as the events of the past months finally caught up with her. Christopher sat across from her, giving her the space to process her emotions while remaining close enough to offer comfort if needed. When her tears finally subsided, he wordlessly offered his handkerchief. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, wiping her face. "I'm sorry for the display." "You have nothing to apologize for," Christopher insisted gently. "You've been through an ordeal that would break most people, yet here you are still standing." "Barely," she admitted with a weak laugh. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come when you did." Christopher's expression grew serious. "I was coming to tell you I couldn't leave without you, that I couldn't bear to go to Sacramento knowing you were trapped with him." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "When I saw what he'd done to you, Margaret, I've never felt rage like that before." "It's over now," she said, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. "He can't hurt me anymore." "No, he can't," Christopher agreed firmly. "But Margaret, you should know legally you're still his wife. What you said at the station was powerful, but not legally binding," she finished for him. "I know." The reality of her situation settled over her like a heavy cloak. She had escaped Franklin's immediate control, but she was still bound to him in the eyes of the law. Any future she might want to build with Christopher or anyone would be complicated by this fact. "We'll find a way," Christopher promised, reading her thoughts. "There are lawyers in Sacramento, with evidence of his abuse, perhaps." "Perhaps," Margaret echoed, not wanting to extinguish the hope in his eyes. But she knew divorce was rare and difficult to obtain, especially for women. Even with proof of abuse, the courts typically favored husbands in such matters. Christopher hesitated, then changed the subject. "How are you feeling? Physically, I mean." Margaret touched her throat gingerly. "Sore. Everything is sore, but I'll heal." "I have some arnica in my medical bag that will help with the bruising," he offered. "And laudanum for the pain if you need it." "No laudanum," she said quickly. "I need to keep my wits about me." Christopher nodded in understanding. They fell into companionable silence as the train continued its journey south, the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails lulling Margaret into a state of exhausted contemplation. So much had changed in a single day, her entire life upended, her future uncertain. Yet alongside the anxiety, a tentative sense of freedom began to bloom. "What will happen when we reach Sacramento?" she asked finally. "I've arranged accommodations near the hospital, separate rooms in a respectable boarding house," Christopher explained. "The hospital administrator knows to expect us tomorrow. I wrote to him when I decided to accept the position." "And what will I be?" "Your assistant." The practical questions helped distract her from the emotional turmoil still churning beneath the surface. Christopher nodded. "To start, if you're willing. The hospital always needs skilled hands, and your experience as a teacher will be valuable." He paused, watching her carefully. "But Margaret, you can be whatever you want to be in Sacramento. You could teach again, or write, or study medicine yourself if that interests you." The idea of having choices again, of building a life according to her own desires rather than someone else's expectations, was both exhilarating and terrifying. For so long, Margaret had suppressed her own wants and needs, focused only on survival. "I hardly know who I am anymore," she admitted softly. "I've spent so long being what others wanted me to be." "Then this is your chance to rediscover yourself," Christopher suggested. "Without pressure, without expectations. I'll be there to support you however you need me to." Margaret studied him across the compartment, this man who had risked everything to help her escape, who looked at her not as property to be possessed, but as a person to be cherished. In his eyes, she saw not just desire or admiration, but genuine respect. "Why did you do it?" she asked suddenly. "Why risk your reputation, your career, your safety all for me?" Christopher's gaze didn't waver. "Because from the first moment, I saw you teaching those children in the schoolhouse, so full of life and kindness despite the constraints of this town. I knew you were remarkable." He smiled slightly. "And then I got to know you, and I discovered you were even more than that. You're brilliant, compassionate, and far braver than you give yourself credit for." "I wasn't brave," Margaret countered. "I married Franklin out of fear." "You did what you had to do to survive," Christopher corrected. "And today, when it mattered most, you found your courage." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Margaret, I care for you deeply, but I want you to know that my help comes with no expectations. You owe me nothing." The sincerity in his voice brought fresh tears to Margaret's eyes. "What if I want there to be something between us? Eventually, when I've had time to heal, then we'll take it one day at a time," he promised. "At your pace, not mine." Margaret nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt the stirring of genuine hope. As the train continued its journey through the gathering dusk, Margaret finally surrendered to exhaustion, her head drooping against the window. Christopher quietly moved to sit beside her, offering his shoulder as a pillow. Half asleep, she accepted, leaning into his warmth. "Rest," he murmured, his voice a comforting rumble beneath her ear. "You're safe now." And for the first time since that fateful night that had led to her hasty marriage, Margaret believed it might be true. Sacramento in 1876 was a city in transition, no longer the rough and tumble gold rush boomtown of the 1850s, but not yet the refined state capital it would become. As their train pulled into the station the following morning, Margaret took in the bustling streets, the mix of elegant brick buildings and wooden storefronts, and the diverse faces of a population drawn from across the country and around the world. "It's so much bigger than Truckee," she observed as Christopher helped her down from the train, her body stiff and painful after the night's journey. "Nearly 30,000 people now," Christopher confirmed, guiding her through the crowded platform with a protective hand at her elbow. The perfect place to disappear and start fresh. They took a hired carriage to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, a 3-story Victorian on a tree-lined street not far from the new hospital. Mrs. Holloway herself greeted them at the door, a formidable widow in her 60s with sharp eyes that missed nothing, including the bruises on Margaret's face and neck. "Dr. Finley," she acknowledged with a nod. "And this must be your assistant, Mrs. Margaret Dobbs," Christopher supplied before Margaret could speak. "Recently widowed and in need of quiet accommodations while she recovers from her journey." Margaret shot him a surprised look, but quickly composed her features. "Widowed, not separated or fleeing a status that would protect her reputation in this new place." "My condolences, Mrs. Dobbs," Mrs. Holloway said, her expression softening slightly. "I have your rooms prepared as requested. Second floor, connected by a sitting room for your medical consultations." "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway," Margaret replied, adopting the subdued manner expected of a recent widow. "Your consideration is appreciated." The older woman led them upstairs, pointing out the dining room and parlor along the way, explaining the house rules and meal times with brisk efficiency. The rooms were small but clean, each furnished with a comfortable bed, wardrobe, writing desk, and washstand. The shared sitting room between them contained a small sofa, 2 armchairs, and a bookcase already stocked with medical texts. "This will do nicely," Christopher said, setting down their bags. "Mrs. Holloway, Mrs. Dobbs is still recovering from her bereavement. Might we have supper sent up this evening?" "Certainly, doctor. I'll have Molly bring it up at 6. With a final assessing glance at Margaret, Mrs. Holloway departed, closing the door behind her. The moment they were alone, Margaret turned to Christopher. "Widowed? A convenient fiction," he admitted, looking slightly chagrined. "I thought it would be easier than explaining the truth, and it gives you protection from gossip while we figure things out. And if Franklin comes looking for me, or if news travels from Truckee, Sacramento is a big city with people coming and going all the time. News from a small mining town isn't likely to make much impact here." He hesitated. "But if it does, we'll deal with it together. I won't let him take you back." Margaret nodded slowly, moving to the window to look out at the unfamiliar street below. "So I'm to be a widow. What happened to my fictional late husband? Mining accident," Christopher suggested. "It would explain our sudden departure from Truckee. And these." She gestured to the bruises on her neck. Christopher's expression darkened. "A fall during your grief." "Though I hate perpetuating the idea that he did anything other than hurt you deliberately." "It's a practical solution," Margaret acknowledged. "And temporary, I hope." "Very temporary," Christopher agreed. "Once we're settled, we can consult a lawyer about your options." He moved toward the door to his own room. "You should rest. Tomorrow will be a busy day at the hospital." "Christopher," she called as he reached for the doorknob. When he turned, she offered him a small, genuine smile. "Thank you for all of this." His answering smile warmed her more than the afternoon sunshine streaming through the window. "You're welcome, Margaret. Welcome to your new life." The Sacramento Medical Institute, was an impressive brick building with wide windows and modern facilities that put Christopher's small Truckee clinic to shame. As they approached the entrance on Margaret's first day as his assistant, she felt a flutter of nervous anticipation. "What if I'm not qualified enough?" she whispered, adjusting the high collar of her dress that concealed the worst of her bruising. "I only helped with basic procedures in Truckee." "You're more qualified than half the so-called medical assistants I've worked with," Christopher assured her. "Besides, you'll be learning as you go. Dr. Harrison knows you're new to formal medical work." Dr. James Harrison, the hospital administrator, was a portly, energetic man in his 50s who greeted Christopher like an old friend and Margaret with professional courtesy. "Mrs. Dobbs, Doctor. Finley speaks very highly of your intelligence and steady hands," he said, shaking her hand firmly. "We're in desperate need of competent assistants, especially in the women's ward. Many of our female patients are more comfortable with a woman present during examinations." "I'm eager to learn and help however I can," Margaret replied, relieved by his matter-of-fact acceptance of her presence. The hospital was a revelation, organized, clean, and equipped with the latest medical innovations. Margaret spent her first day shadowing Christopher as he made his rounds, observing procedures and assisting with patient records. By afternoon, she was helping dress wounds and administer medications under his supervision. "You're a natural," Christopher told her as they walked back to the boarding house that evening. "Did you see how you calmed that little boy before I set his arm? Even some experienced nurses struggle with frightened children." Margaret felt a flush of pride at his praise. "I suppose my teaching experience helps. Children respond to confidence and kindness." "Exactly the qualities that make a good healer," he agreed. Days turned into weeks as they settled into their new routine. Margaret proved herself so capable that Dr. Harrison soon assigned her to assist other physicians when Christopher was occupied. The work was challenging but fulfilling, allowing her to use both her intellect and her natural empathy. In the evenings, she and Christopher would often sit in their shared sitting room, discussing cases, reading medical journals, or simply enjoying each other's company. Sometimes he would teach her more advanced medical concepts, his face lighting up with enthusiasm as he explained the circulatory system or the latest theories on germ transmission. "You could be a doctor yourself, you know," he told her one night as she successfully diagnosed a case from his description. "There are women's medical colleges now, not many, but they exist." Margaret looked up from the medical text she'd been studying, surprised by the suggestion. "Me, a doctor?" "Why not? You have the mind for it, and the heart." The idea took root in her imagination. Dr. Margaret Sinclair, treating patients of her own, perhaps even specializing in women's medicine where female doctors were so desperately needed. But the practical obstacles remained overwhelming. "I'm still legally married," she reminded him, "and medical school costs money I don't have." "The marriage can be addressed with time," Christopher said carefully. "As for money, I would gladly help." Margaret shook her head firmly. "I won't be dependent on anyone again, Christopher." "Not even you. It wouldn't be dependency. It would be investment in your future and our future if you want that." He paused, watching her reaction closely. "But I understand your hesitation." The weeks stretched into months. Spring arrived in Sacramento, bringing blooming gardens and longer evenings. Margaret's bruises healed, leaving no physical marks of her time with Franklin, though the emotional scars remained. Nightmares sometimes woke her, leaving her gasping and disoriented until she remembered she was safe in Sacramento, not back in Truckee. On those nights, she would often find Christopher already awake in their sitting room, ready with a cup of tea and quiet company until she felt calm enough to return to sleep. He never pressed her to talk about the dreams, never made her feel weak for having them. His steady presence became her anchor in the new life they were building. Their relationship evolved slowly, respectfully. Small touches his hand on hers while examining a patient together, her fingers straightening his collar before rounds grew more frequent. Shared smiles across a hospital ward carried deeper meaning. But Christopher never overstepped, never assumed, always allowing Margaret to set the pace. It was Margaret who finally bridged the remaining distance between them on a warm evening in late April. They had just returned from a particularly difficult day at the hospital, having lost a young mother in childbirth, despite their best efforts. The woman's husband had been inconsolable, his grief a palpable thing that filled the delivery room as he clutched his newborn daughter and wept. "I keep thinking about that poor man," Margaret said quietly as they sat in their sitting room, a pot of tea cooling between them. "How his entire life changed in an instant." Christopher nodded somberly. "It's the hardest part of medicine, knowing that sometimes, no matter what you do, it isn't enough. But also knowing that the child survived because of you," Margaret added. "That little girl will live because you didn't give up, even when it became clear her mother couldn't be saved." "We didn't give up," he corrected gently. "You were there every step, keeping that baby breathing while I tried to stop the bleeding." Margaret looked down at her hands that had held a newborn life, that had fought alongside Christopher to save what could be saved. Hands that were no longer shaking with fear but steady with purpose. "Christopher," she said softly, meeting his gaze across the small table, "these past months, you've given me back myself. You've shown me what it means to be valued, respected, to be seen." His eyes softened. "You did that yourself, Margaret. I just had the privilege of watching you bloom once you were free from his shadow." "Not entirely free," she reminded him. "Not yet. Perhaps sooner than we thought," Christopher said, reaching into his pocket to withdraw an envelope. "This came for me at the hospital today. It's from Sheriff Miller in Truckee." Margaret's heart stuttered. "What does it say?" Christopher handed her the letter. "Read it yourself." With trembling fingers, she unfolded the paper, eyes scanning quickly over the sheriff's neat handwriting. "Dr. Finley, I write to inform you of events in Truckee that may be of interest to you and Mrs. Dobbs. Franklin Dobbs was found dead in his store 3 days ago, the apparent result of a heart seizure. The coroner confirms natural causes. As I recall, Mrs. Dobbs left town rather hastily. While I understand her reasons, there are matters of inheritance and property that require her attention as Dobbs' widow. Please advise her to contact Judge Wilson at her earliest convenience to arrange these matters. I hope you both are well in your new circumstances. Regards, Sheriff Thomas Miller. Margaret looked up, her expression a complex mixture of shock, relief, and something like guilt. "He's dead?" "Yes," Christopher confirmed simply. "I should feel something more," she whispered. "Sadness, perhaps, or at least pity." "You feel what you feel," Christopher said. "There's no right way to respond to news like this." Margaret read the letter again, the implications slowly sinking in. "I'm a widow, truly now, not just in our convenient fiction. Yes, I'm free." The words tasted strange on her tongue, wonderful and terrifying all at once. "Yes," Christopher repeated, watching her carefully. "Free to do whatever you choose." Margaret set the letter down and rose from her chair, moving to stand before him. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out to take his hands in hers. "What I choose," she said softly, "is this, us, if that's still what you want." Christopher stood, his hands still clasping hers. "It's all I've wanted since I first knew you, but Margaret, there's no rush. You should take time to—" She silenced him by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his, their first kiss. Tentative at first, then blooming into something deeper as Christopher's arms came around her, drawing her closer. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Margaret smiled up at him. "I've taken enough time," she whispered. "I know my own mind and heart now." In the weeks that followed, Margaret corresponded with Judge Wilson in Truckee regarding Franklin's estate. To her surprise, she inherited not only the store but also a substantial sum from his banking accounts. Franklin, it seemed, had been far wealthier than she had realized during their marriage, a fact he had deliberately concealed from her. "What will you do with it?" Christopher asked, when she showed him the banker's draft that arrived from Truckee, nearly $15,000, a small fortune in 1876. Margaret's answer was immediate and certain. "First, I'll apply to the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania for the fall term." Christopher's face lit up with pride. "They'd be fortunate to have you. And the rest," she continued, "I'll save for our future, whatever that may be." Their future began to take shape with surprising speed. By summer, Margaret had been accepted to medical school for the fall term, and Christopher had secured a position at a respected hospital in Philadelphia, not far from the college. They married in a small ceremony at Sacramento's First Presbyterian Church, with Dr. Harrison giving the bride away and several of their hospital colleagues in attendance. "Mrs. Finley," Christopher murmured as they stood together at the train station, preparing to depart for their new life in the East. "Or should I say, the future Dr. Finley?" Margaret laughed, happiness bubbling up inside her like a spring. "Either suits me, as long as I'm with you." As the train pulled away from Sacramento, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From the frightened schoolteacher who had married out of desperation, to the confident woman embarking on a life she had chosen for herself, with a man who saw her as an equal partner rather than a possession. "What are you thinking?" Christopher asked, noting her contemplative expression. Margaret smiled, leaning into his side as the California landscape rolled past. "I was thinking about what you said to me that day in Truckee when I first considered leaving with you. You told me I didn't have to hide anymore, not who I was, not what I wanted." "And you don't," he affirmed, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "No," Margaret agreed, tilting her face up to his. "I don't have to hide here. 20 years later, Doctor." Margaret Finley stood at the podium in Philadelphia's Academy of Medicine, addressing a room full of medical students, both men and women, on the latest advancements in obstetrical care. At 52, her auburn hair was now streaked with silver, and fine lines framed her eyes, but her voice was strong and confident as she spoke about the techniques she had pioneered that had significantly reduced maternal mortality rates in her practice. In the front row sat her husband, Dr. Christopher Finley, now the director of Pennsylvania Hospital, his proud smile as bright as it had been on their wedding day. Beside him sat their 16-year-old daughter, Sarah, who had inherited her mother's auburn hair and her father's blue eyes, along with both their passions for medicine. Their 14-year-old son, Thomas, more interested in law than medicine, had elected to remain home with his studies. As Margaret concluded her lecture to enthusiastic applause, Christopher rose to his feet, leading the standing ovation with undisguised admiration. When the crowd finally dispersed, he made his way to the podium where Margaret was gathering her notes. "Brilliant as always, my love," he said, helping her with her papers. "You had them spellbound." Margaret smiled, the years of shared life and love evident in the ease between them. "It helps to have supportive faces in the audience." Sarah joined them, her eyes bright with excitement. "Mother, Dr. Richardson asked if I could observe a surgery tomorrow. He said your recommendation carried significant weight." "Of course it does," Christopher said with a wink. "Your mother is only the most respected obstetrician in Philadelphia." Margaret laughed, linking her arms through her husband's and daughter's as they walked toward the exit. A far cry from the schoolteacher who fled Truckee all those years ago. Not so far, Christopher disagreed gently. You were always this remarkable. You just needed the freedom to show it. Outside, the streets of Philadelphia bustled with the energy of a new century on the horizon. As they made their way home in the mild autumn evening, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her here, the pain and fear that had eventually led to this life of purpose, respect, and deep, abiding love. "What are you thinking?" Christopher asked, echoing the question he had asked so many times over their years together. Margaret squeezed his arm, her smile radiant in the golden light of the setting sun. "I was thinking how grateful I am that you came for me that day, that you showed me I didn't have to hide anymore." "And you never will again," Christopher promised, bending to kiss her forehead as their daughter walked ahead, giving them a moment of privacy. "Not as long as I'm here." "I know," Margaret replied simply, secure in the truth of his words and in the life they had built together, a life where she had never again needed to hide who she truly was.